Welcome to Still Science Lab. Tonight, we are going to direct our gaze toward the most familiar, heavily scrutinized object in the night sky and systematically dismantle the deepest, most profoundly comforting illusion humanity has ever held about our place in the cosmos. We are going to explore a recent, paradigm-shifting revelation that has sent absolute shockwaves through the highest echelons of the astronomical community, because NASA just detected a terrifying shift inside the Moon. This is not a theoretical model sketched out on a whiteboard, nor is it a distant, abstract anomaly happening millions of light years away in the obscure, unreachable depths of deep space. This is a violent, active, and fundamentally hostile physical reality unfolding right now, right on our celestial doorstep, on the very rock we have boldly and arrogantly claimed as our next grand frontier. To truly comprehend the suffocating, existential dread of this discovery, we must first recognize and confront the profound psychological grip that the Moon has held over the human species since the very dawn of our conscious existence. For millennia, spanning the entirety of our recorded history and bleeding deep into our ancient, forgotten mythologies, we have looked up at that pale, silver sphere and seen the ultimate, unchanging symbol of silent permanence. The Earth, our immediate cradle, is a world defined by endless, chaotic kinetic energy and violent geological recycling. Our home is characterized by the relentless, churning power of liquid oceans, the violent, grinding collision of massive tectonic plates, and the howling, unpredictable fury of our atmospheric storms. Our terrestrial landscape is constantly, aggressively being erased and rewritten by the sheer, untamed power of nature. Mountains are thrust upward only to be painstakingly ground back down into dust by the wind and the rain. But the Moon has always stood in absolute, stark, and beautiful defiance to this localized chaos. It hangs in the freezing dark vacuum of space as a perfectly static, frozen monument to the ancient past. To the naked human eye, and even through the intricately polished lenses of our most powerful, modern terrestrial telescopes, the lunar surface presents a picture of absolute, undisturbed tranquility. We see the exact same ancient, overlapping craters, the exact same sprawling, dark seas of solidified basalt, and the exact same towering, jagged, impact-forged mountain ranges that our prehistoric ancestors stared at from the mouths of their caves millions of years ago. It possesses no howling atmospheric winds to erode its razor-sharp rocks, no flowing rivers of liquid water to carve its valleys, and no violently churning, molten mantle to rip its continents apart. We have heavily, perhaps desperately, conditioned ourselves through generations of observation to view the Moon as a geologically dead world, a peaceful, silent graveyard suspended in the eternal cold of the void. This deeply ingrained, comforting terrestrial bias was only magnified and cemented into absolute scientific dogma when we finally achieved the impossible, defying the immense gravity of our homeworld to physically cross the gulf of space and touch its surface. When the Apollo astronauts stepped out of their fragile, foil-wrapped landing modules and placed their heavy, pressurized boots into the soft, pulverized regolith, they reported a landscape of profound, suffocating stillness. They described a magnificent desolation, a completely sterile, frozen museum of the early solar system, perfectly preserved within the uncompromising vacuum of space. The footprints they pressed into the fine grey dust were confidently expected to last for tens of millions of years, entirely undisturbed by any geological or atmospheric force, serving as a permanent, unchanging testament to the pinnacle of human triumph. We looked at the sterile, static, and unyielding nature of the moon and felt a profound, deeply arrogant sense of ownership. We viewed it not as a dynamic, evolving celestial body with its own internal mechanics, but as a vast, empty stage, simply waiting patiently for us to arrive. We confidently designated it as the ultimate cosmic stepping stone, the quiet, predictable, and solid harbor from which humanity would eventually launch its grand, inevitable conquest of the wider galaxy. We assumed, with the absolute hubris of a species that has only ever known one habitable world, that the ground beneath our boots was solid, unyielding, and forever at peace. But the universe does not abide by our comforting assumptions, and it is entirely indifferent to our grand biological ambitions. That profound, historical silence, the peaceful stillness we have projected onto the moon for thousands of years, is a catastrophic, potentially lethal lie. The modern, hypersensitive instruments we have pointed at our celestial neighbor, coupled with the meticulous, uncompromising analysis of decades of seismic and orbital data recently finalized by NASA researchers, have violently ripped the veil off this static illusion. The terrifying, undeniable reality is that the moon is not a peaceful graveyard. It is not a frozen, unchanging museum of ancient impacts, and it is certainly not a stable, predictable foundation for human colonization. It is actively, violently shifting. Beneath its cold, grey, deceptively calm exterior, the entire sphere is convulsing in a state of continuous, agonizing seismic distress. The fundamental architecture of the rock is breaking. The brittle crust is snapping. The moon is currently in the active process of tearing itself apart, and for half a century we have been completely, blissfully oblivious to the scale of the mechanical violence happening right beneath the dust. The existential dread of this discovery completely and violently rewrites our entire relationship with our closest celestial neighbor. We are forced to abandon the romanticized vision of a quiet, waiting harbor and confront the brutal physics of a dying celestial body. We are not preparing to step onto a welcoming shore. We are actively drawing up massive international plans, spending billions of dollars, and risking fragile human lives to construct our pressurized, airtight glass houses directly on top of a fundamentally unstable, wildly unpredictable tectonic nightmare. The comforting image of a dead, static world has been violently replaced by the terrifying specter of a massive rock in the throes of a prolonged, agonizing structural collapse. The ground itself, the very foundation we require to anchor our survival in the lethal vacuum of space, is shifting, buckling, and thrusting upward in a chaotic, unending sequence of mechanical failures. To understand the sheer horror of this environment, you must realize that space is already actively trying to kill us in a multitude of invisible, horrific ways. We must engineer our fragile habitats to withstand the absolute zero of the lunar night, the boiling, unfiltered radiation of the daytime sun, the constant, invisible barrage of micrometeorites, and the terrifying, biological decay induced by existing in a fractional gravity well. We believed that if we could just conquer the vacuum, if we could just build a strong enough box to hold our breathable air and shield our soft tissue from the cosmic rays, the ground would simply support us. We believed the geology of the moon was a solved equation. But now, the ground itself has been weaponized against us. We are about to step onto a world that physically rejects our presence, a fractured, convulsing landscape where the solid rock acts like shattered ice on a turbulent sea. As we look up at the moon tonight, we can no longer afford the luxury of seeing a symbol of peaceful permanence. We must look at the pale light and recognize a fractured, groaning death trap, an active zone of ruin that is fiercely, mechanically convulsing in the dark, entirely indifferent to the fragile, biological anomalies that mistakenly believe they can tame a world that is actively tearing itself to pieces. The universe does not forge worlds in the quiet, peaceful cold of the dark. It hammers them together in a chaotic crucible of unimaginable kinetic fury. Billions of years ago, the object we now intimately call our moon was not the pale, silent ghost that haunts our night sky. It was a churning, roiling ocean of superheated, glowing magma born from the apocalyptic violence of a localized, planetary-scale collision. It was a fluid sphere of boiling rock, radiating an agonizing, blinding thermal signature out into the freezing void of the early solar system. That immense heat, that primordial fire of creation, is the fundamental lifeblood of any celestial body. It is the absolute, energetic currency that dictates whether a world will be a dynamic, shifting, living geological system or a frozen, static tomb. On our own planet, the sheer, staggering mass of the Earth, combined with the slow, grinding radioactive decay of heavy elements buried deep within its core, acts as a colossal, insulating blanket. We have successfully trapped that ancient, violent fire beneath our feet, allowing it to drive our shifting tectonic plates, fuel our erupting volcanoes, and generate the massive, churning magnetic shield that actively protects our fragile, water-based biology from the lethal radiation of the sun. Earth remains a geologically living, breathing entity strictly because its internal furnace is still roaring in the dark. But the moon suffers from a profound, fatal architectural flaw that doomed it from the very moment of its fiery conception: its severe lack of physical mass. It is simply too small to hold on to the violent memory of its own birth. Suspended in the absolute, unforgiving thermodynamic sink of deep space, the moon is completely surrounded by an infinite expanse of freezing vacuum that sits just a few degrees above absolute zero. Deep space is not merely empty. It is a relentless, unfeeling, and highly efficient parasite that aggressively drains thermal energy from absolutely anything that dares to hold it. For over 4 billion years, in total, unbroken silence, the moon has been hemorrhaging its primordial heat out into the dark. The internal furnace that once kept its deep interior pliable, molten, and geologically active has been slowly, methodically starved. As the millions of years stretched agonizingly into billions, the deep rock began to freeze. The churning, slow-motion convection currents of subterranean magma slowed, thickened, and finally stalled entirely. The lunar core is actively dying, its ancient fire reduced to a fading, localized ember buried beneath thousands of miles of crushing, insulating stone. To fully understand the terrifying mechanical consequence of this cooling process, we must look at the immutable, fundamental laws of thermodynamics. When physical matter loses thermal energy, the chaotic, microscopic vibrations of its constituent atoms begin to slow down. Without the aggressive, outward push of heat to keep them physically separated, these atoms are forced by the laws of physics to pack themselves closer and closer together. On a small, everyday human scale, we witness this phenomenon constantly: the slight, groaning contraction of a steel bridge in the dead of winter, or the shrinking of materials left out in the freezing cold. But when you apply this exact same uncompromising physical law to a macroscopic, celestial body possessing a diameter of over 2,000 miles. The results are nothing short of apocalyptic. The entire interior volume of the Moon is physically shrinking. Millions upon millions of cubic miles of deep lunar mantle and heavy core material are slowly, inevitably losing their physical volume. The deep rock is condensing, packing tighter and tighter in the suffocating dark. This is not a violent, instantaneous event that would register as a sudden, cinematic explosion in the night sky. It is something infinitely more insidious, a horror born of slow, unrelenting inevitability. It is a slow-motion implosion. The immense, crushing weight of the Moon's own gravity is actively and aggressively exploiting this thermal deficit. Gravity never sleeps, it never weakens, and it constantly, relentlessly pulls all mass directly toward the exact mathematical center of the sphere. As the deep interior cools and surrenders its volume, gravity ruthlessly pulls the dying rock tighter, dragging the entire celestial body inward. The Moon is literally collapsing in on itself. By meticulously analyzing orbital data and high-resolution surface imagery, NASA scientists have mathematically documented that over the last few 100 million years, which is a mere fleeting blink of an eye in cosmic timescales, the Moon has physically shrunk by more than 150 feet in circumference. To a human mind accustomed to the permanent, unchanging, and solid horizon of the Earth, a planetary body actively losing over 100 feet of its own physical girth is a terrifying, reality-breaking concept. The solid ground is physically retreating inward, pulled inevitably toward a dying, freezing core. Imagine a piece of fruit left completely abandoned in the freezing, unforgiving cold. Over time, as the moisture and vitality are slowly drained from its flesh by the harsh environment, the interior begins to wither and shrink. The volume of the fruit steadily decreases, pulling tightly inward toward the pit. The Moon is experiencing this exact same localized, systemic withering, only its flesh is composed of billions of tons of solid silicate rock and heavy iron, and the cold draining its life is the absolute, inescapable freezing vacuum of the interstellar void. It is a drying, rotting celestial body, physically contracting as the last vestiges of its ancient, primordial heat are stolen away by the indifferent universe. It is a world that is quietly folding in on itself, growing smaller and denser as the eons tick by, entirely unable to fight against the crushing, inward pull of its own mass. And this relentless inward collapse creates a catastrophic geometric nightmare for the outer shell of the planet, while the deep, high-pressure interior of the Moon is still just barely warm enough to slowly compress and mold itself to this shrinking, imploding reality. The cold, dead, heavily irradiated surface crust is profoundly, rigidly brittle. It is a hardened shell of shattered basalt and fused glass that absolutely cannot shrink smoothly to accommodate the rapidly disappearing volume beneath it. As the core pulls away, dragging the mantle inward, it creates a massive, agonizing structural deficit right beneath the surface. The solid foundation upon which we intend to land our fragile, billion-dollar spaceships and build our pressurized human habitats is literally falling out from underneath the crust. The entire outer skin of the Moon, the cold, grey landscape we have romantically gazed at for centuries, is currently being subjected to an unimaginable, global compressive stress. It is caught in a relentless, crushing vice that is tightening with every single fraction of a degree that the core cools. The surface is being forced to wrap around a sphere that is becoming mathematically too small for it. We are not looking at a stable, dead rock. We are looking at a pressurized, shifting tectonic time bomb entirely driven by the dying embers of a primordial furnace. The moon is shrinking, gravity is pulling it down into the dark, and the brittle, unyielding crust is being pushed to the absolute breaking point, setting the stage for a violent, mechanical reckoning that will shatter the silence of the void and turn our promised cosmic harbor into an active, convulsing death trap. To understand the terrifying mechanical reality of the lunar surface, we must first abandon the comforting way we understand the ground beneath our own feet. On Earth, when the immense tectonic plates that make up our planet's crust are subjected to unimaginable stress, they possess a hidden, saving grace. They float upon a churning, superheated, and highly lubricated layer of molten mantle. When two massive continental plates collide, one can gracefully and violently subduct, sliding deep beneath the other, while volcanic activity and atmospheric erosion constantly work to smooth and recycle the resulting scars. Our world is dynamic, but it is also highly elastic and continuously healing. The moon possesses absolutely none of this geological mercy. Its outer crust is a single, unbroken, and profoundly brittle shell of solidified basalt and anorthosite. It has been completely baked dry by billions of years of unfiltered solar radiation and frozen solid by the absolute zero of the prolonged lunar night. It possesses absolutely zero elasticity, zero lubrication, and zero capacity to gracefully absorb mechanical stress. It is a rigid, unyielding cage of stone. When the dying, cooling core of the moon slowly implodes, dragging the deep mantle inward, this rigid outer crust is left completely stranded. It suddenly finds itself wrapping around a planetary body that is mathematically too small for its current surface area. The fundamental laws of geometry dictate that the outer shell must shrink to match the disappearing volume beneath it, but the rigid stone cannot simply contract like a deflating balloon. The lunar surface literally has nowhere to go. It is caught in a state of agonizing, relentless global compression. Millions of square miles of solid rock are being continuously, aggressively squeezed from all sides by the inescapable pull of gravity and the shrinking architecture of the deep interior. The mechanical stress builds silently in the freezing vacuum, storing immense, terrifying amounts of kinetic energy within the crystalline structure of the crust. The profound, haunting silence of the lunar landscape is a deceptive, temporary mask, perfectly hiding an environment that is practically screaming under unimaginable, planet-wide tectonic pressure. Solid rock, no matter how ancient, dense, or heavily compressed, possesses a definitive, mathematical breaking point. When the crushing, compressive stress finally exceeds the ultimate structural integrity of the lunar crust, the ground does not merely bend, warp, or quietly fold. It violently, catastrophically snaps. The rigid crust suffers a massive mechanical failure, creating deep-rooted thrust faults that plunge miles into the dark subsurface. Because the entire global landscape is being aggressively squeezed together with nowhere to expand, the failure mechanism forces the shattered crust to overlap. Entire regions of the moon, billions of tons of jagged, unyielding stone, are violently thrust upward and pushed directly over the adjacent terrain. The ground is literally cannibalizing its own surface area, desperately thrusting massive slabs of rock into the black sky simply because it is rapidly running out of room. This brutal, mechanical overriding creates terrifying geological formations that planetary scientists call Lobate Scarps. These are massive, step-like cliffs that snake erratically across the lunar surface for dozens of miles, twisting and weaving like jagged, raised scars across the face of the dead world. To visualize the sheer horror of this process, you must imagine the deafening, terrifying spectacle of crushing ice on a freezing Arctic Ocean during a winter storm. Picture massive, jagged flows of thick ice being relentlessly pushed together by unseen, powerful currents until one colossal slab violently buckles, shatters, and rides directly up and over another, grinding and crushing everything in its path. Now, strip away the atmosphere, remove the howling wind and the crashing water, and replace that frozen ice with billions of tons of razor-sharp, heavily irradiated basalt, snapping and grinding against itself in the absolute, dead silence of a vacuum. This is the horrifying, active reality of the lunar surface. The ground is being pushed into towering, overlapping waves of shattered stone. For decades, we looked at the grainy orbital photographs of the moon and mistakenly categorized these scarps alongside the ancient, weathered impact craters and the sprawling, dark maria of the lunar seas. We possess a deep, desperate psychological need to believe that all geological violence on the moon concluded billions of years ago during the chaotic, fiery infancy of the solar system. We deeply wanted to believe that these cliffs were ancient, dead relics of a violent past, long since stabilized and permanently frozen in time. But when NASA deployed the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, capturing high-resolution imagery of the surface with unprecedented, terrifying clarity, that comforting illusion was completely and irreversibly shattered. When we zoom in on the sheer, jagged faces of these towering cliffs, we see a horrifying lack of degradation. These are not ancient, weathered canyons that have been softly eroded by the slow, relentless rain of micrometeorites over billions of years. They are fresh, razor-sharp wounds carved directly into the face of the moon. We can clearly observe these lobate scarps aggressively cross-cutting and slicing straight through small, relatively young impact craters, physically distorting their perfect circular shapes and tearing them in half. We can see massive, jagged boulders resting at the absolute base of these cliffs, stones that have recently tumbled down the sheer faces and have not yet been buried by the slow accumulation of cosmic dust. The pristine, unweathered nature of these features mathematically proves their horrifying youth. They are active. They are currently forming. The terrifying realization that echoes through the halls of modern astrophysics is that the tectonic trauma of the moon is not a historical footnote. It is happening right now, in the modern era, as we casually look up at the silver disk from the safety of our backyards. The existence of these fresh, actively growing thrust faults completely transforms the lunar surface from a challenging, sterile environment into a fundamentally hostile, weaponized landscape. When we plan our audacious, highly publicized Artemis missions, meticulously calculating fuel payloads and orbital trajectories, we are planning to land incredibly fragile, pressurized cylinders of ultra-thin aluminum and glass onto a surface that is actively snapping and shifting. These lobate scarps can stretch for dozens of miles and tower hundreds of feet into the pitch-black sky, representing insurmountable, jagged walls of pulverized rock that can easily block rovers, sever communication lines, and completely isolate landing parties. They are physical barricades, violently erected by a dying world. And because the global thermal contraction of the moon's core is an ongoing, unstoppable physical process, the compressive pressure on the surface is never truly relieved. It is only temporarily transferred. The tectonic stress is constantly migrating, searching for the next weakest point in the brittle crust. A seemingly quiet, perfectly flat plain of grey dust, the exact kind of deceptively safe terrain we would specifically target for a sprawling human base camp, could violently buckle and snap at any given moment. Without any warning, the rigid ground could fracture, thrusting upward to become a new, razor-sharp cliff face, completely tearing apart the foundations of any human infrastructure unfortunate enough to be built across its invisible, pressurized fault line. We must entirely and permanently discard the deeply ingrained myth of the solid, unchanging lunar ground. The shattered skin of the moon is a stark, terrifying testament to the brutal, unyielding physics of planetary contraction in a vacuum. It is a world that is quietly suffocating in the dark, squeezing itself to death, and violently tearing its own face apart in a desperate, mechanical attempt to fit around a dying, shrinking core. The Lobate Scarps are the visible, jagged teeth of this tectonic nightmare, proving with absolute, uncompromising clarity that the moon is not a peaceful, waiting stepping stone. It is a convulsing, fractured death trap. The surface is continuously snapping under agonizing pressure, and the very ground we arrogantly intend to claim as our next great frontier is actively, violently breaking beneath the dust. When we reflect upon the monumental, audacious triumphs of the Apollo program, our collective human memory inevitably gravitates toward the triumphant, highly sanitized optics of the endeavor. We replay the grainy, black and white television broadcasts of men in pressurized suits bounding across the gray regolith. We marvel at the stark, brilliant contrast of the American flag planted firmly against the absolute black of the cosmic void, and we immortalize the iconic photographs of our fragile, blue marble rising silently over the desolate lunar horizon. We view these missions as the ultimate, definitive conquest of a dead world. But in our desperate, romanticized clamor to celebrate the brief, fleeting presence of human biology on the lunar surface, we have entirely forgotten the silent, unblinking sentinels that our astronauts deliberately left behind in the dark. Before they climbed back into their ascent modules and fired their engines to return to the comforting, oxygen-rich embrace of the Earth, they meticulously deployed the Apollo lunar surface experiments packages. Among these intricate, gold foil-wrapped instruments were a network of incredibly sensitive seismometers, delicate mechanical ears placed directly against the cold, pulverized skin of the moon. The scientific rationale for leaving these fragile machines behind was rooted in a profound, deeply arrogant terrestrial assumption. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the prevailing, unquestioned consensus of the astrophysical community was that the moon was a geologically completely dead, frozen relic of the early solar system. We did not place those seismometers on the lunar surface to monitor active, internal tectonic plates, because we confidently believed that no such internal dynamics could possibly exist within a body so small and so ancient. We built those machines, powered them with the slow, agonizing decay of radioactive plutonium isotopes, and left them completely isolated in the freezing vacuum of space merely to act as passive, highly sensitive tripwires. We expected them to spend their operational lifespans quietly recording the faint, random, and entirely external thuds of wandering micrometeorites slamming into the surrounding regolith, or perhaps to measure the subtle, gravitational flexing caused by the tidal pull of the Earth. We expected them to listen to a quiet, peaceful graveyard, transmitting nothing but the monotonous, predictable silence of a dead rock interrupted only by the occasional, localized splatter of cosmic debris. For 8 years, these forgotten listeners sat completely alone in the absolute, uncompromising desolation of the lunar environment. They endured the boiling, unfiltered radiation of the 2-week-long lunar days, where surface temperatures skyrocketed to hundreds of degrees above zero, and they survived the suffocating, absolute zero freeze of the 2-week-long lunar nights. Through it all, their internal mechanisms dutifully recorded the microscopic vibrations of the ground beneath them, converting the mechanical shivering of the lunar bedrock into a continuous, unbroken stream of telemetry that was beamed silently back across 240,000 miles of empty space to the massive radio dishes waiting on Earth. But the data they returned was incredibly complex, noisy, and deeply confusing to the primitive, room-sized computers of the Apollo era. The scientists of the 1970s identified thousands of distinct seismic events, but the archaic technology of the time severely limited their ability to accurately pinpoint the exact epicenters or fully comprehend the physical mechanics behind the deepest, most violent vibrations. Eventually, the funding dried up. The seismometers were permanently deactivated, and the massive reels of magnetic tape containing the seismic heartbeat of the moon were quietly archived, locked away in climate-controlled vaults, and largely forgotten by a world that had moved on to the space shuttle and the construction of orbital stations. It was not until nearly half a century later that the true, terrifying reality of those forgotten recordings was finally brought into the light. Modern astrophysicists, armed with the staggering, unprecedented computational power of 21st century supercomputers and highly advanced machine learning algorithms specifically designed to filter out scattered noise, decided to blow the dust off those ancient magnetic tapes and take a second, uncompromising look at the Apollo data. They fed the raw, decades-old telemetry into modern seismic models, stripping away the static and the interference of the fractured lunar crust, desperately trying to triangulate the exact origins of the most powerful, sustained tremors recorded by the forgotten listeners. What they found completely shattered the foundational, comforting myth of the dead moon. The algorithms did not reveal the random, scattered footprints of external meteor strikes. They revealed a terrifying, highly localized pattern of extreme, internal, mechanical violence. The most powerful, devastating vibrations recorded by the Apollo seismometers, perfectly aligned with the exact geographical locations of the massive, razor-sharp Lobate scarps that were actively tearing the lunar surface apart. The suffocating existential dread of this revelation is profound. We had left those machines in the dark, fully expecting them to document the quiet, peaceful silence of a planetary corpse. Instead, they had been forced to listen to the agonizing, terrifying groans of a dying world convulsing in the vacuum. In the absolute, freezing silence of space, where there is no atmosphere to carry the sound of a scream or the roar of an explosion, the only medium capable of transmitting energy is the solid rock itself. And the rock was screaming. When the shrinking, imploding core of the moon forced the rigid, brittle crust to its absolute breaking point, the seismometers felt the violent, catastrophic snap. They recorded the exact, horrifying moments when millions of tons of solid, unyielding basalt violently fractured, thrusting upward and grinding aggressively against itself under the unbearable, crushing pressure of global contraction. These machines were completely isolated, sitting alone in the pitch-black lunar night, mechanically feeling the ground beneath them actively tear itself to pieces. They were the sole, silent witnesses to a planetary-scale structural failure. On Earth, when a fault line slips, the resulting earthquake is an immensely destructive but fleeting event. The massive oceans of liquid water and the heavily fractured, elastic nature of our tectonic plates act as colossal, planetary shock absorbers, rapidly dampening the seismic energy and causing the violent shaking to subside within a matter of seconds, or at most, a few minutes. But the moon is bone dry. It possesses no oceans, no subterranean aquifers, and no soft, molten asthenosphere to cushion the blow. It is a solid, rigid, and completely shattered sphere of dry stone. When a massive thrust fault snapped near the Apollo landing sites, the immense kinetic energy of the fracture had nowhere to dissipate. The shockwave did not fade. It became violently trapped within the rigid architecture of the crust. The forgotten listeners recorded a horror that defies terrestrial comprehension. They documented shallow moonquakes, registering up to a staggering magnitude of 5.5 on the Richter scale that did not simply shake the ground and pass. Because of the bone-dry, rigid nature of the lunar rock, the violent vibrations rang through the crust like a massive, continuously struck bell. The seismometers recorded the terrifying reality that the ground did not stop shaking for hours. For entire, agonizing hours, the surface of the moon violently vibrated, shifting and grinding in a continuous, unrelenting state of mechanical torture. If human beings had been inside their pressurized habitats when those fault lines snapped, they would not have experienced a brief, terrifying jolt. They would have been subjected to an unending, maddening, and structurally devastating vibration that lasted for half of a terrestrial workday, watching helplessly as the seams of their fragile, foil-wrapped life support systems were methodically, relentlessly shaken apart by the very ground they had trusted to support them. We must look back at the Apollo program with a chilling, newfound perspective. We sent our bravest explorers to the surface of another world, completely unaware that we were landing them directly on top of an active, convulsing tectonic minefield. We arrogantly planted our flags and declared the moon conquered, leaving our mechanical proxies behind to monitor the silence. But the silence was a lie, a failure of our own limited, primitive technology to understand the dark. The forgotten listeners faithfully did their job. They sat in the freezing, irradiated dirt and dutifully recorded the true, violent nature of the moon. They captured the exact, terrifying moments when the dying rock fiercely snapped its own spine in the dark, proving with absolute mathematical certainty that the ultimate symbol of celestial peace in our night sky is, in reality, a fractured, groaning nightmare that is currently, actively, and violently tearing itself apart under the crushing weight of its own localized demise. Human civilization has evolved alongside the terrifying, unpredictable violence of earthquakes. When the massive, grinding tectonic plates of our home world violently slip, releasing immense pockets of stored kinetic energy, the ground beneath our concrete cities violently rolls, tears, and shatters. But in all our terrestrial experience with seismic catastrophe, we have always relied on one profound, unyielding biological and geological mercy, the absolute brevity of the event. An earthquake is an acute trauma. It is a sudden, blinding spike of localized kinetic fury that typically exhausts its destructive potential in a matter of seconds, or at its absolute worst, a few agonizing minutes. Our architecture, our emergency protocols, and our very psychological resilience are entirely built around this fundamental, comforting assumption of brevity. We construct our towering skyscrapers to temporarily sway and absorb a momentary shock, knowing with absolute certainty that if the building can just survive that initial, terrifying minute of violent acceleration, the ground will inevitably return to a state of stable rest. This rapid cessation of violence is not a coincidence. It is the direct, physical result of our planet's incredibly unique, life-giving composition. The Earth is heavily saturated with liquid water. Our massive oceans, our deep subterranean aquifers, and the heavily fractured, highly elastic nature of our molten mantle act as a colossal, planetary-scale shock absorber. As the violent seismic waves ripple outward from the epicenter of a fault line, they are aggressively dampened by the fluid-soaked rock, their energy rapidly bleeding away into the surrounding, forgiving environment until the violent shaking quickly fades back into a comforting, predictable silence. But when we turn our grand, biological ambitions toward the colonization of the moon, we must completely and permanently abandon this comforting terrestrial physics. The lunar environment is completely devoid of the geological mercy of water. It is a profoundly, aggressively, bone-dry world. For billions of years, the absolute, freezing vacuum of deep space and the boiling, unfiltered radiation of the daytime sun have relentlessly baked every single microscopic molecule of moisture out of the lunar crust. There are no underground rivers to lubricate the fault lines, no oceans to absorb the kinetic energy, and no fragmented, sliding tectonic plates resting on a bed of soft magma to disperse the mechanical stress. The outer shell of the moon is a single, uninterrupted, monolithic block of highly crystalline, completely desiccated silicate rock. It possesses the uncompromising structural rigidity of a massive, planet-sized piece of shattered glass. This fundamental lack of moisture and elasticity transforms the physical mechanics of a seismic event from a brief, localized trauma into an unending, systemic nightmare. When the dying, shrinking core of the moon forces the brittle crust to violently buckle and snap, creating the jagged thrust faults known as Lobate scarps, the resulting release of kinetic energy does not behave like a terrestrial earthquake. It triggers a shallow moonquake, a terrifying phenomenon that completely defies our earthly understanding of geological violence. When the immense, crushing tectonic pressure finally breaches the ultimate tensile strength of the lunar basalt, and a massive slab of solid rock violently thrusts upward, the resulting shockwave is injected directly into this bone-dry, highly rigid crystalline cage. Because there is absolutely no liquid water to dampen the acoustic energy, and no soft, elastic mantle to absorb the blow, the kinetic force of the fracture simply has nowhere to go. It cannot bleed away. It cannot dissipate. Instead, the highly energetic seismic waves are violently trapped within the upper layers of the crust. They ripple outward from the epicenter at terrifying speeds, violently bouncing and ricocheting off the internal structural boundaries of the rock, echoing endlessly back and forth through the desiccated stone. To understand the sheer, mechanical horror of this physics, you must imagine a colossal bronze bell. If you were to submerge that massive bell deep in a tank of water and strike it with a heavy iron hammer, the resulting vibration would be immediately muffled, choked out in a fraction of a single second by the heavy, dampening resistance of the fluid. That is an earthquake on our water-rich planet. But the moon is a bell suspended in the absolute, frictionless silence of a vacuum composed entirely of rigid, dry stone. When the dying planet violently strikes that bell through a tectonic fracture, there is nothing in the environment to muffle the ringing. The entire celestial body begins to violently vibrate, and it simply refuses to stop. The shallow moonquakes recorded by the forgotten Apollo seismometers revealed a reality that is fundamentally incompatible with the fragile, delicate nature of human engineering. They documented shallow seismic events, registering up to a staggering magnitude 5.5 on the Richter scale, that did not simply roll through the crust and fade away. They registered continuous, violent shaking that lasted for entire, agonizing hours. Imagine the suffocating, claustrophobic terror of being an astronaut stationed inside a pressurized, highly complex lunar habitat when one of these shallow faults violently snaps. You are living inside a fragile cylinder of ultra-thin aluminum, Kevlar, and composite glass, separated from the lethal, boiling vacuum of deep space by only a few inches of advanced material science. Suddenly, the solid, grey ground beneath your heavy boots violently jolts. Your terrestrial instincts, honed by millions of years of earthly evolution, scream at you to brace yourself, to hold on tight, and to simply ride out the next 30 seconds of terror. You grip the metal bulkheads, waiting desperately for the violent shuddering to peak and then gracefully subside into safety. But the expected relief never comes. 30 seconds pass, and the habitat is still violently pitching. 5 minutes pass, and the structural supports are groaning under the relentless, rhythmic torsion. 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an entire hour grinds by, and the ground is still violently, mechanically convulsing with the exact same terrifying intensity as the initial shock. You are trapped in a state of unending, structural torture. This is the catastrophic architectural dilemma of the lunar surface. Human engineering is simply not designed to withstand continuous, high-amplitude vibration for hours on end without suffering profound, inevitable mechanical failure. In a terrestrial earthquake, a building only has to survive a very brief, intense window of extreme stress. But on the Moon, the prolonged, relentless shaking subjects every single weld, every single rivet, and every microscopic seal of the habitat to a devastating, inescapable process known as metal fatigue. As the dry rock rings like a struck bell for 2, 3, or even 4 continuous hours, the rigid framework of the human outpost is repeatedly bent, twisted, and torqued thousands upon thousands of times. The intense, high-frequency vibrations violently shake the sensitive life support machinery, threatening to shatter the brittle, spinning turbines of the oxygen scrubbers and violently rupture the pressurized, hyper-cooled liquid lines that prevent the station from overheating in the solar glare. It is a slow, agonizing, and highly mechanical execution. The psychological toll of enduring such an event would be an entirely new, terrifying frontier of human trauma. You would be forced to sit in the deafening, vibrating metal box, listening to the agonizing, rhythmic groans of your own life support system being methodically shaken to pieces, entirely aware that just beyond the vibrating walls lies an infinite, hostile vacuum waiting patiently to instantly boil your blood and freeze your lungs. You would be completely paralyzed, entirely unable to repair the invisible microfractures forming in the pressure seals because the ground simply refuses to hold still. The Moon is effectively weaponizing its own dead, rigid architecture to actively reject our biological presence. It does not need howling atmospheric storms, corrosive rains, or churning oceans of lava to destroy us. It simply utilizes the brutal, uncompromising physics of a dry, contracting sphere. When the crust snaps, the prolonged, unending convulsion of the shallow moonquake serves as a terrifying, mechanical reminder that we are profoundly unwelcome. We are arrogantly attempting to bolt our fragile glass houses to the surface of a fractured, ringing nightmare, fundamentally ignoring the terrifying reality that when the Moon breaks, it does not just shake the ground. It subjects absolutely everything on its surface to hours of unrelenting, structural agony, violently shaking our grand, historic ambitions of colonization until they simply shatter in the dark. When we envision the granular surfaces of our own world, we are heavily influenced by a deeply ingrained, comforting terrestrial bias, regarding the nature of dust and sand. We walk barefoot across the expansive golden dunes of our deserts and the soft, yielding beaches of our coastlines, fundamentally unaware of the immense geological mercy that makes such an experience possible. On Earth, the raw, jagged bones of the planet are constantly subjected to the relentless, smoothing engines of atmosphere and liquid water. For millions of years, the howling winds and the churning, rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves act as colossal, planetary-scale tumblers. They patiently, methodically grind the sharp edges off the broken rocks, tumbling them against one another until they are worn down into microscopic, perfectly smooth, and mathematically forgiving spheres. We can comfortably inhale the fine dust of a dry terrestrial wind, or let the beach sand slip harmlessly through our fingers, strictly because our planet has spent eons polishing its own shattered crust. But when we arrogantly project this comforting, biological understanding of granular matter onto the lifeless, grey expanse of the lunar surface, we are making a catastrophic and potentially lethal miscalculation. The moon possesses no gentle atmospheric breezes, no flowing rivers, and no crashing oceans to soften its geology. The powdery grey coating that blankets its entire surface is not sand, and it is certainly not soil. It is a completely alien, fiercely abrasive substance known as lunar regolith, and it is, quite literally, weaponized geology. To truly comprehend the sheer microscopic horror of lunar regolith, we must look at the brutal, unyielding mechanism of its creation. For over 4 billion years, the moon has been completely exposed to the unforgiving crossfire of the cosmos, lacking even the thinnest wisp of an atmosphere to shield its surface. It has been subjected to a continuous, unending bombardment of micrometeorites, tiny, hypervelocity projectiles, traveling through the vacuum of space at tens of thousands of miles per hour. When one of these microscopic bullets violently slams into the rigid, frozen basalt of the lunar crust, it does not simply chip the rock. The extreme kinetic energy of the impact triggers a localized, subatomic apocalypse. The solid stone is instantaneously pulverized, physically shattered into millions of microscopic fragments, while the intense, blinding heat of the friction flash melts the surrounding silicate. But because this violent detonation occurs in the absolute, freezing void of a vacuum, the vaporized rock does not have time to gracefully cool or crystallize. It is instantaneously flash-frozen in the dark, solidifying in a fraction of a millisecond. This relentless, billion-year-long process of violent impact, flash melting, and instant freezing has created a microscopic landscape of unparalleled terror. If you were to place a single pinch of lunar regolith under a powerful electron microscope, you would not see the smooth, comforting spheres of terrestrial sand. You would be staring directly into a microscopic abattoir. The regolith is composed of millions of incredibly jagged, asymmetrical shards of unbroken glass and torn volcanic rock. It is a chaotic, tangled mess of razor-sharp hooks, barbed spears, and fractured, crystalline blades. Because there is no wind or water to ever erode or smooth these edges, a particle of lunar dust forged in a violent impact 3 billion years ago is exactly as razor-sharp today as the very millisecond it was created. It is the ultimate, perfect abrasive, completely untouched by the softening hand of time. During the Apollo missions, this weaponized dust proved to be one of the most immediate, terrifying threats to human survival. It aggressively clung to the astronauts' spacesuits, driven by a powerful, static electrostatic charge generated by the constant bombardment of unfiltered solar radiation. It effortlessly ground its way into the highly advanced, meticulously engineered joints of their pressurized suits, violently stripping away the protective Kevlar and rapidly degrading the vital airtight seals. When the astronauts returned to the confined, pressurized safety of their lunar modules, they inevitably dragged this microscopic shrapnel inside with them. As they removed their helmets, they were instantly assaulted by the pungent, metallic smell of the regolith, a scent they famously compared to spent gunpowder. But inhaling this dust is not a mere nuisance, it is a biological nightmare. Drawing those microscopic, razor-sharp glass hooks into the soft, delicate, and highly vulnerable tissues of the human lungs triggers a severe, agonizing inflammatory response known as lunar hay fever. In a long-term colonization scenario, prolonged exposure to this airborne shrapnel would inevitably lead to a rapid, lethal form of silicosis, physically shredding the astronauts' respiratory systems from the inside out. But the microscopic, biological threat of the regolith is only the beginning of the nightmare. The true, macroscopic horror of this weaponized dust is fully realized when it interacts with the terrifying tectonic reality of the shrinking moon. The lunar surface is not flat. It is heavily scarred by massive, towering impact craters, some of which feature sheer, jagged walls that plunge miles down into the dark, shadowed depths. Over billions of years, the relentless rain of micrometeorites has blanketed these steep, precarious slopes with incredibly thick layers of this razor-sharp regolith. Millions of tons of loose, pulverized glass and rock are resting on the very edge of gravitational stability, precariously perched at the tops of towering crater rims, held in place only by the weak, fractional gravity of the moon and the jagged, interlocking friction of the dust particles themselves. When the dying, imploding core of the moon finally forces a shallow fault line to violently snap, triggering a localized magnitude 5 moonquake, this delicate, precarious balance is instantly, catastrophically shattered. As we have established, a moonquake does not merely jolt the ground and pass. It rings the rigid, bone-dry crust like a massive bell, subjecting the entire landscape to hours of unrelenting, high-amplitude vibration. When this continuous, violent shaking strikes the towering, dust-choked walls of a crater, the mechanical friction that holds the millions of tons of regolith in place is completely and violently overcome. The jagged, microscopic hooks of the dust vibrate, detach, and begin to flow. What follows is an avalanche of incomprehensible terror, completely divorced from our terrestrial understanding of a landslide. On Earth, a massive rockslide or a tumbling wall of snow is a deafening, roaring event, preceded by the deep, terrifying rumble of breaking stone and the atmospheric rush of displaced air. But the lunar avalanche is an event of absolute, terrifying silence. In the frictionless, dead vacuum of space, millions of tons of razor-sharp shrapnel violently detach from the crater wall and plunge downward without making a single, solitary sound. Because there is absolutely no atmospheric drag to slow the descent, and because the intense electrostatic charge causes the individual particles of glass to rapidly repel one another, the avalanche does not tumble like terrestrial rocks. It behaves like a colossal, localized tsunami of superfluidized, dry liquid. It billows outward into the vacuum, a massive, silent, encroaching black cloud of absolute destruction cascading down the sheer cliff face at terrifying velocities. This silent, roaring tide of weaponized geology is the ultimate, lethal trap for human exploration. In our desperate search for frozen water ice and permanent shadows to shield our habitats from the boiling solar radiation, NASA specifically intends to build the Artemis base camps at the absolute bottoms of these deep, ancient craters near the lunar South Pole. We are intentionally placing our fragile, pressurized glass houses directly in the firing line of these precarious, towering slopes. If a prolonged, shallow moonquake were to violently ring the crust while human beings were stationed below, they would have absolutely no atmospheric warning. They would not hear the roar of the approaching destruction. They would only feel the continuous, agonizing vibration of the ground. And then, looking out the reinforced quartz windows of their habitat, they would see the stars completely blotted out by a massive, silent, descending wall of absolute blackness. When the avalanche finally strikes the outpost, it would not be a soft burial. Millions of tons of dense, heavy, and unimaginably abrasive glass shrapnel would violently slam into the human architecture. The sheer kinetic force of the impact would effortlessly crush the delicate thermal radiators, instantly sever the vital communication arrays, and violently bury the fragile solar panels, instantly plunging the habitat into complete, freezing darkness. The razor-sharp dust would aggressively pack itself around the pressurized modules, grinding into the exterior airlocks and permanently fusing the mechanical doors shut. The astronauts inside would survive the initial impact, only to realize they have been permanently entombed beneath millions of tons of static-charged, abrasive stone. They would be trapped in the dark, buried alive in a silent, freezing grave of microscopic glass, slowly suffocating as their power reserves fail, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that the very surface they arrogantly believed they could conquer is, in reality, a heavily armed, weaponized landscape just waiting to be shaken loose. We possess a deeply ingrained, almost biological imperative to view our home world, the Earth, as the ultimate, unassailable sanctuary. We look out at the sprawling, vibrant blue of our oceans, the thick, protective blanket of our atmospheric gases, and the churning, invisible magnetic field that heavily shields our fragile biology from the lethal, boiling radiation of the sun, and we project an aura of absolute, nurturing benevolence onto our planet. We think of Earth as a rare, miraculous mother, a highly specialized oasis of life suspended in the harsh, unforgiving, and sterile desert of the cosmos. But in the cold, unfeeling architecture of astrophysics, planetary bodies do not possess morality, and they certainly do not harbor benevolence. Stripped of our comforting terrestrial bias, the Earth is nothing more than a colossal, localized concentration of mass, a massive, unyielding gravity well that completely and utterly dominates its surrounding space-time. And gravity, in its purest, most fundamental, and inescapable form, is not a gentle, guiding tether. It is a ruthless, uncompromising, and inherently violent force of subjugation. When we look up at the moon, we see a silent companion, a celestial partner seemingly locked in a perpetual, harmonious dance with our world. We believe that we are simply passive, distant observers to the slow, agonizing thermal contraction and the violent tectonic fracturing of its dying crust. We desperately want to believe that the moon's destruction is an isolated tragedy, an inevitable consequence of its own inadequate mass and its freezing, imploding core. But this assumption is a profound, comforting lie that completely ignores the brutal mechanics of our local solar system. The Earth is not an innocent, passive bystander in the mechanical death of the moon. Our world is the active, relentless architect of its seismic agony. To understand the sheer, terrifying scale of this celestial abuse, we must look past the simple, two-dimensional, perfect circles of planetary orbits that we were taught to visualize in our youth. The Moon does not trace a perfect, peaceful, equidistant ring around the Earth. It is trapped in a highly elliptical, deeply eccentric trajectory, a constantly shifting, agonizing path that brings it violently close to our planet before swinging it far out into the freezing, isolated dark. Furthermore, the Moon is tidally locked to the Earth. The immense, localized gravitational pull of our world has forcefully, violently slammed the brakes on the Moon's rotation over billions of years, permanently anchoring one single hemisphere to face us in a state of perpetual, terrifying subjugation. It is held entirely by the throat, completely unable to turn away. As the Moon travels along its elliptical path, the gravitational relationship between the two massive bodies undergoes a massive, continuous, and highly destructive fluctuation. When the Moon reaches perigee, the absolute closest mathematical point in its orbit to the Earth, the gravitational grip of our massive world violently intensifies. The Earth's immense mass reaches across the 240,000 miles of empty vacuum and physically, aggressively grabs the solid, rigid rock of the Moon. It does not merely pull, it aggressively stretches. The tremendous tidal forces physically distort the spherical shape of the dead world, violently pulling the lunar crust and the heavy underlying mantle toward the Earth, creating a massive, localized bulge of solid, unyielding stone. Then, as the Moon continues its orbit and swings out toward apogee, the furthest point in its lonely, elliptical path, that crushing, asymmetrical gravitational grip momentarily relaxes, allowing the stretched, agonizing rock to violently snap back toward its original, spherical shape. This is not a gentle, fluid, or forgiving process. The Moon is not a ball of soft, pliable clay, nor is it a world covered in elastic, shock-absorbing oceans of liquid water. As we have established, the lunar crust is a single, uninterrupted, and profoundly brittle shell of bone-dry, shattered basalt and fused volcanic glass. It is a world that has completely lost its internal heat, a world that is already actively collapsing in on itself under the agonizing, inescapable pressure of global thermal contraction. The brittle rock is already pushed to the absolute, mathematical breaking point by its own dying, shrinking core. Now, introduce the devastating, continuous tidal stress of the Earth into this highly pressurized, tectonic nightmare. Every single month, without fail, for billions of years, the immense gravity of our home world acts as a colossal, invisible vise. It rhythmically, relentlessly massages the fractured, dying rock of our companion. It squeezes, stretches, and violently torques the highly stressed, overlapping fault lines of the lunar crust. The Earth is actively, mechanically working the fragile, shattered skin of the Moon, aggressively probing the rigid, crystalline basalt for the absolute weakest points in its structural architecture. When the modern researchers finally fed the massive, confusing archives of the Apollo seismic data into high-fidelity orbital models, they uncovered a correlation that completely shatters any lingering illusion of celestial innocence. The terrifying, shallow moonquakes, the violent, unending convulsions that ring through the dead rock for hours on end do not occur randomly. They are not merely the spontaneous, unpredictable failures of a shrinking crust acting in isolation. They are directly, mathematically tethered to the aggressive orbital dance with the Earth. The absolute most violent, destructive seismic events recorded on the lunar surface overwhelmingly occur precisely when the Moon is at apogee or perigee. They happen at the exact, terrifying moments when the immense, invisible tidal vise of the Earth reaches its absolute maximum compressive or tensile strength. Our planet is actively pulling the trigger. The immense tectonic pressure generated by the moon's shrinking, imploding core cocks the mechanical weapon, building up the massive, localized kinetic energy along the jagged, overlapping thrust faults of the Lobate Scarps. But it is the relentless, tidal squeezing of the Earth that finally forces the stone to violently, catastrophically snap in the dark. We are forced to confront a deeply unsettling, horrifying reality about our own localized cosmic environment and our ambitious plans for the future of human spaceflight. We are not living next to a peaceful, dying rock. We are actively, relentlessly torturing it. The Earth's massive gravity well is a ruthless engine of destruction, continuously subjecting the brittle, shrinking corpse of the moon to an unending cycle of mechanical stretching and crushing. If human explorers are stationed in their fragile, pressurized glass habitats near the highly fractured, unstable regions of the lunar South Pole, and the ground beneath them suddenly, violently gives way, triggering a catastrophic avalanche of razor-sharp regolith or hours of unrelenting, structural vibration, they will not be the victims of a random, isolated geological event. They will be the direct, tragic casualties of their own home, world's immense, unyielding gravitational dominance. The earthquake that shatters their vital life support systems, violently ruptures their pressure seals, and exposes them to the boiling, lethal vacuum of space will have been actively orchestrated by the very planet they left behind. We are arrogantly attempting to build our future outposts on a massive planetary torture rack that is entirely operated by the Earth. This realization permanently transforms the serene silver light of the moon into a chilling, constant testament to the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the solar system. Every single time we look up at the night sky, we are not simply admiring a beautiful, natural satellite peacefully reflecting the light of the sun. We are looking directly at a massive, ongoing crime scene of orbital physics. We are watching a dead, shrinking world being systematically, rhythmically crushed to death by the inescapable, invisible gravity of our own planet. The Earth is wrapping the moon in a fatal, inescapable embrace, squeezing its fractured, highly pressurized fault lines until they violently break. We are the architects of its unending seismic agony, entirely responsible for the relentless, mechanical convulsions that are actively tearing the lunar surface apart, proving with absolute certainty that in the cold, uncaring architecture of the cosmos, even the most beautiful, seemingly symbiotic relationships are built entirely on a foundation of absolute, overwhelming kinetic violence. The ambition of human spaceflight is entirely chained to a single, heavy, and profoundly inconvenient molecule: water. To sustain our fragile, terrestrial biology in the lethal, irradiated vacuum of deep space, we require massive, continuous quantities of liquid water. We need it to hydrate our soft tissues. We need to mathematically split its atomic bonds to breathe the resulting oxygen, and we need to refine it into the highly volatile, explosive liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen propellants required to fuel our return rockets. But lifting thousands of gallons of heavy, sloshing water out of the Earth's immense, crushing gravity well is a logistical and economic nightmare. It requires staggering amounts of thrust and billions of dollars in highly specialized orbital rocketry just to bring enough water to keep a handful of astronauts alive for a few brief, terrifying weeks. If humanity is ever going to establish a permanent, sustained, and truly independent foothold on the lunar surface, we absolutely cannot rely on a continuous, fragile supply line stretching 240,000 miles back to our home world. We must learn to live off the dead land. We must find water in the dark. For decades, this absolute biological necessity dictated the ultimate trajectory of our off-world ambitions. When orbital probes finally peered deep into the pitch-black, eternally frozen depths of the massive impact craters dominating the lunar South Pole, they discovered the ultimate prize. They found sprawling, ancient deposits of water ice locked away in the permanently shadowed regions where the warming light of the sun has not touched the jagged rock for billions of years. This discovery instantly, irrevocably transformed the lunar South Pole from a desolate, freezing wasteland into the absolute holy grail of modern space exploration. It became the singular, overriding target for NASA's highly publicized Artemis program. We drew a massive, ambitious target directly over these frozen, dark craters. We began designing the sprawling, pressurized base camps, the high-tech solar arrays, and the heavy extraction machinery required to mine the ice. We envisioned a bustling, permanent human outpost, a shining beacon of our technological supremacy, proudly built right on the edge of the absolute dark. We looked at the orbital maps and saw an oasis, a localized harbor perfectly designed to sustain our biological expansion into the wider solar system. But the universe is not a benevolent host, and it does not leave its most valuable resources unguarded in a peaceful sanctuary. The cosmos fundamentally operates on a deeply terrifying, unforgiving principle of cruel irony. When the scientists fed the latest, ultra-high-resolution topological data from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and the reanalyzed seismic telemetry from the forgotten Apollo listeners into their massive supercomputers, the resulting tectonic map of the lunar South Pole completely shattered the optimistic, sanitized vision of the Artemis program. The data revealed a horrifying, deeply localized nightmare. The lunar South Pole is not a stable, frozen lake waiting patiently for our arrival. It is, without question, one of the most heavily fractured, mechanically unstable, and tectonically tortured regions on the entire surface of the Moon. The exact same geological forces that created those deep, shadowed craters, the colossal, ancient impacts that shattered the crust and permanently hid the ice from the sun, also created a localized environment of supreme structural weakness. When you combine this ancient, shattered architecture with the ongoing, relentless tectonic agony of the Moon's shrinking, dying core, the results are absolutely catastrophic. The global compressive stress generated by the thermal contraction of the interior does not distribute itself evenly across the lunar surface. It aggressively, violently seeks out the weakest points in the rigid, brittle crust. And the heavily bombarded, deeply scarred terrain of the South Pole is a sprawling, localized network of these exact structural vulnerabilities. The orbital cameras captured a terrifying concentration of fresh, razor-sharp lobate scarps aggressively cross-cutting the very craters where we desperately intend to land. The ground here is not just buckling, it is actively, violently tearing itself to pieces at an accelerated, highly concentrated rate. This terrifying geological reality forces humanity into what astrophysicists refer to as the Artemis dilemma, a suffocating, existential paradox that completely undermines our grand architectural ambitions. We are trapped between two absolute, uncompromising necessities of survival. We desperately need the ancient water ice buried in the dark to sustain our fragile biology and fuel our rockets. But we absolutely require a stable, solid, and geologically dead foundation upon which to safely construct our highly pressurized, incredibly fragile glass houses. The brutal, unyielding physics of the moon dictate that we cannot have both. The exact location we must target to harvest the water is the exact location most likely to violently snap and tear our infrastructure apart. The oasis is a confirmed, active tectonic minefield. We are willfully, arrogantly planning to parachute our astronauts directly into the most dangerous, geologically volatile kill zone on the lunar surface. We are engineering highly complex, airtight habitats composed of lightweight aluminum, advanced polymers, and reinforced quartz glass. These structures are fundamentally designed to hold a localized bubble of warm, breathable atmospheric pressure against the crushing, lethal vacuum of space. They are incredibly delicate, highly pressurized balloons, relying entirely on the perfect, unbroken integrity of thousands of microscopic seals and rigid internal frameworks. Now, imagine taking this delicate, pressurized balloon and aggressively bolting it directly to a jagged slab of bone-dry, shattered basalt that is currently being subjected to unimaginable global compressive stress. When the inevitable tectonic failure occurs, it will not be a gentle, warning tremor. When the immense, localized pressure at the South Pole finally overcomes the ultimate tensile strength of the lunar rock, a fresh thrust fault will violently snap into existence directly beneath or immediately adjacent to the Artemis base camp. The brittle crust will aggressively heave upward, instantly displacing millions of tons of stone. The resulting shallow moonquake will inject a massive, highly energetic shockwave directly into the bone-dry, highly rigid, crystalline cage of the surface. And because there is no liquid water and no elastic mantle to dampen the blow, the ground beneath the pressurized habitat will not simply shake and then return to a state of rest. It will begin to violently, relentlessly ring like a struck bell, subjecting the human outpost to hours of uninterrupted, high-amplitude mechanical torture. The human mind struggles to fully conceptualize the sheer compounding terror of this localized apocalypse. The continuous, agonizing vibration will immediately begin to violently torque and twist the rigid framework of the habitat. The delicate, life-sustaining machinery, the spinning oxygen scrubbers, the pressurized thermal regulators, the fragile communication arrays pointing desperately toward Earth will be methodically, mercilessly shaken to pieces. The high-frequency mechanical stress will rapidly induce microscopic metal fatigue across the entire structure, silently tearing away at the vital airtight seals. A breach the size of a pinpoint is all it takes for the lethal vacuum of space to violently assert its dominance, aggressively sucking the breathable atmosphere out of the habitat in a terrifying, freezing rush. And simultaneously, as the ground violently rings and the pressure seals begin to scream, the towering, dust-choked walls of the surrounding craters will suffer catastrophic frictional failure. Millions of tons of weaponized, razor-sharp regolith will silently detach from the precipice, cascading down in a massive, frictionless black avalanche of abrasive glass. This microscopic shrapnel will completely bury whatever fragments of the outpost managed to survive the initial seismic shattering. The astronauts inside would be entirely isolated from the Earth, trapped inside a violently vibrating metal tomb that is rapidly losing oxygen, completely buried beneath millions of tons of static-charged, lung-shredding rock. The South Pole trap completely redefines the nature of our off-world expansion. We are not simply facing the cold, the vacuum, and the radiation. We are facing a planetary surface that actively, mechanically baits us with the very resources we need to survive, only to place them in the exact center of an active tectonic death trap. We have drawn a massive, highly publicized target on the absolute most dangerous region of the Moon. We are pouring our greatest technological achievements and risking our bravest explorers to build a permanent home on a foundation of shattering glass. It is a profound, terrifying testament to human hubris, a desperate biological gamble against the cold, unfeeling architecture of a dying world that is violently shifting in the dark, entirely indifferent to the fragile, pressurized houses we arrogantly intend to build upon its breaking back. Human engineering is fundamentally arrogant, an entire discipline built upon a deeply comforting but highly localized terrestrial illusion. From the towering steel monoliths that aggressively scrape our atmospheric skies, to the sprawling, heavily reinforced subterranean networks of concrete that anchor our modern cities, every single architectural triumph in human history relies entirely upon one profound, unspoken geological assumption: the eventual, inevitable return to stillness. We meticulously design our massive suspension bridges to gracefully flex and sway in the howling wind, and we engineer our deepest foundations to temporarily absorb the violent, terrifying shock of a terrestrial earthquake. But all of our complex mathematics, all of our advanced material science, is predicated on the absolute confidence that the kinetic violence will rapidly cease. We build with the unwavering certainty that the ground will eventually stop shaking, allowing the compromised steel to rest, the shifting load-bearing walls to settle, and the microscopic stress fractures to stabilize before they can catastrophically propagate. This assumption of ultimate stability is deeply woven into the very fabric of our biology and our structural ambitions. We simply do not possess the terrestrial experience to comprehend or conquer a physical landscape that fundamentally refuses to settle. When we turn our grand biological ambitions outward to the desolate grey expanse of the lunar surface, we carry this deeply ingrained terrestrial arrogance with us, manifesting it in the blueprints and the construction of our off-world habitats. We must fully understand that a lunar base, such as the ones proposed for the Artemis program, is not a building in any traditional, earthly sense. It is a highly complex, desperately fragile balloon. It is a pressurized cylinder of ultra-thin aluminum alloys, advanced Kevlar composites, and reinforced quartz glass, actively and continuously holding a localized bubble of warm, moist, breathable atmospheric pressure against the crushing, lethal, and absolute nothingness of a freezing vacuum. Space is already actively trying to kill us in a multitude of invisible, horrific, and uncompromising ways. The absolute zero of the prolonged, 2-week-long lunar night desperately attempts to freeze the life-giving fluids in the environmental control systems, while the unfiltered, boiling solar radiation of the daytime sun relentlessly bombards the outer hull, seeking to mutate, burn, and destroy the soft, water-based tissue of the astronauts huddled inside. Furthermore, the utter lack of atmospheric pressure means that the breathable air inside the habitat is constantly, violently pressing outward against the hull, desperately trying to escape into the infinite void. Simply existing in this environment requires an absolute engineering miracle, a delicate, unbroken chain of mechanical perfection where every single weld, every titanium rivet, and every microscopic rubber O-ring must perform flawlessly, continuously, without a single millisecond of failure. Now, introduce the terrifying, relentless mechanical reality of a dying, shrinking world into this already precarious, highly stressed equation. We are taking this delicate, pressurized balloon and attempting to bolt its rigid, unyielding framework directly to a shattered, bone-dry crust that is actively convulsing under the immense, crushing pressure of global thermal contraction. Designing an airtight habitat to survive the sheer, passive hostility of the vacuum and the radiation is a monumental task, but designing it to survive a magnitude 5 shallow moonquake that violently rings through the rigid stone for 5 continuous hours is an unprecedented, paralyzing engineering nightmare. There is no elastic, fluid-filled, shock-absorbing foundation that human science can currently invent that can gracefully endure hours of high-amplitude, unrelenting, and chaotic vibration without suffering profound, catastrophic mechanical degradation. When the brittle fault line finally snaps beneath the outpost, triggering a localized upheaval of the lunar rock, the resulting kinetic energy does not simply shake the structure and pass into the mantle. Because the moon is completely devoid of dampening liquid water, the shockwave becomes violently trapped within the rigid architecture of the crust and the habitat itself. The continuous, agonizing mechanical vibration travels violently up through the landing struts, bypassing the inadequate dampeners and injecting its high-frequency torsion directly into the pressurized hull. This sustained, rhythmic torture introduces a lethal, invisible, and deeply terrifying enemy known to material science as metal fatigue. It is a silent, microscopic killer that thrives on repetition and unyielding kinetic stress. As the bone-dry rock rings like a continuously struck bell for hour after agonizing hour, the rigid framework of the human outpost is repeatedly bent, twisted, and torqued thousands upon thousands of times. The intense mechanical stress violently pulls at the atomic bonds of the aerospace-grade aluminum and titanium, creating microscopic, invisible fissures deep within the crystalline structure of the metal. These microscopic tears slowly, methodically propagate, racing silently along the stress lines, entirely unseen by the human eye or the internal diagnostic sensors. The continuous, agonizing vibration forces these structural wounds to converge on the absolute weakest, most vital points of the entire habitat: the airtight pressure seals, the specialized rubberized gaskets, the advanced silicone polymers, and the complex mechanical airlocks that stand as the only physical barrier between the fragile human biology and the boiling vacuum of space, are simply not designed to be violently, continuously ground against one another for half of a terrestrial workday. Under the relentless, agonizing friction of the unending quake, they begin to warp, degrade, and mechanically fail. The sheer, suffocating horror of this architectural failure lies in its sudden, catastrophic, and deeply violent finality. The astronauts trapped inside the violently pitching module would have absolutely no warning of the microscopic failure unfolding within the walls. They would be strapped into their acceleration couches or huddled in the center of the module, enduring the deafening, maddening roar of the vibrating bulkheads, praying for the ground to finally settle. They would be watching their telemetry screens flicker, listening to the agonizing groans of the life support machinery being shaken to pieces, entirely unaware that the structural integrity of their sanctuary has already been irreparably, fatally compromised by the relentless vibration. It only takes a single, microscopic breach, a mechanical failure the size of a pinpoint in a highly stressed window seal, or a microscopic tear in an airlock gasket that has been rubbed raw by 3 continuous hours of tectonic ringing. The exact moment the pressurized, oxygen-rich atmosphere inside the habitat finds an escape route into the infinite, hungry void of space, the resulting depressurization is not a slow, gentle, cinematic leak that affords the crew time to patch the hole or don their pressurized suits. It is a violent, explosive, and apocalyptic decompression. The immense, outward-pushing force of the pressurized air violently catches the microscopic fissure and instantly tears it wide open, aggressively ripping the compromised metal and degrading seals apart. The habitat violently exhales. In a terrifying, freezing rush, the breathable atmosphere, the ambient heat, and the very life-sustaining pressure of the module are instantly sucked out into the dark. The sleeping or sheltering astronauts would be immediately, brutally exposed to the lethal environment they had spent billions of dollars trying to keep out. The sudden, absolute drop in pressure would cause the fluids in their bodies to violently boil while simultaneously freezing their lungs, an agonizing, instantaneous biological erasure orchestrated entirely by the mechanical failure of their surroundings. This terrifying scenario completely redefines the nature of our off-world expansion, transforming it from a bold adventure into an exercise in architectural futility. We are forced to confront the chilling realization that the moon is not merely a difficult, passive environment waiting to be cleverly engineered around. It is a physically rejecting entity. The ground itself, the very foundation we arrogantly claimed as our next cosmic stepping stone, actively and mechanically refuses to let us build. We are attempting to impose our terrestrial rules of engineering onto a dying, fractured rock that refuses to hold still. The moon is actively weaponizing its own agonizing tectonic demise, using the unending, ringing convulsions of its shrinking crust to systematically shake our fragile, pressurized glass houses to pieces. It is the ultimate architecture of failure, a terrifying guarantee that our ambitious, highly publicized attempts to conquer the lunar surface are built on a foundation that will violently, inevitably shatter in the dark, exposing our profound fragility to the cold, unfeeling, and deeply hostile mechanics of the universe. For the entirety of our modern spacefaring era, humanity has desperately clung to a profoundly comforting narrative regarding our ultimate destiny among the stars. We have looked up at the familiar, cratered face of the moon and projected onto it the romanticized, historical ideals of terrestrial exploration. We have collectively, almost universally, defined it as the ultimate cosmic stepping stone. In our grand biological ambition to escape the gravitational confines of the Earth and spread our civilization across the dark, freezing expanse of the solar system, we convinced ourselves that the universe had graciously provided us with a perfectly designed training ground. We viewed the moon as a quiet, welcoming harbor situated just off the coast of our home world, a serene, geologically dead beachhead where we could safely practice the intricate, high-stakes mechanics of deep space survival before taking the terrifying plunge toward Mars and the outer planets. We believed that if we could simply conquer the sheer logistical nightmare of crossing the 240,000 miles of empty vacuum, the celestial body waiting for us at the end of that journey would offer a stable, unmoving, and peaceful foundation. We assumed, with the breathtaking arrogance of a species that has only ever known the forgiving, water-rich geology of a single planet, that the grey dust would passively accept our footprints, and the ancient, silent rock would effortlessly bear the weight of our sprawling, pressurized ambitions. But the meticulous, unyielding observations of modern astrophysics, combined with the terrifying, reanalyzed seismic echoes captured by the forgotten Apollo listeners, have completely and violently eradicated that comforting delusion. We have stripped away the silver light of human mythology, and beneath it, we have uncovered a mechanical reality of unimaginable horror. The moon is not a peaceful, waiting harbor. It is not a sterile, frozen museum of ancient cosmic history, and it is most certainly not a safe, reliable stepping stone for human colonization. It is a fractured, actively convulsing death trap. It is a dying, shrinking world caught in the agonizing, slow-motion throes of a global structural collapse. Its core is freezing, its rigid, bone-dry crust is violently snapping under the crushing, inescapable pressure of thermal contraction, and its highly stressed fault lines are being continuously, mercilessly squeezed and torqued by the massive, invisible tidal gravity of our own planet. It is a world that is literally tearing its own face apart in the dark, pushing massive slabs of razor-sharp basalt into the pitch-black sky and triggering devastating, shallow moonquakes that ring through the lifeless stone for hours on end like a continuously struck bell. This terrifying paradigm shift entirely rewrites the psychological and physical parameters of our off-world expansion. We are no longer preparing to establish a permanent presence on a passive, sleeping giant. We are actively, willfully drawing up blueprints to parachute our bravest explorers and our most incredibly fragile, highly pressurized glass habitats directly into the center of a roaring, tectonic minefield. The locations we so desperately need to target for our survival, the deep, eternally shadowed craters of the lunar South Pole where ancient water ice hides from the boiling radiation of the sun, are now mathematically confirmed to be the absolute most heavily fractured, geologically unstable regions on the entire celestial body. We are planning to build our gleaming, airtight outposts at the absolute bottom of towering, jagged cliffs choked with millions of tons of weaponized, razor-sharp regolith, completely ignoring the terrifying reality that the ground beneath our foundation is fully primed to violently snap. The suffocating dread of this realization lies in the absolute incompatibility between the delicate, predictable requirements of human engineering and the chaotic, unrelenting violence of the lunar environment. Space is already a fundamentally hostile theater of operations, constantly attempting to freeze the fluids in our machinery, instantly boil our blood in the vacuum, and shred our cellular DNA with unfiltered solar radiation. But we arrogantly believed that we could engineer our way out of those atmospheric and radiologic threats, so long as the ground simply held still. Now, we must confront the chilling fact that the ground itself actively rejects our presence. The moon physically refuses to let us build. A single, localized tectonic failure, a sudden thrust fault violently buckling beneath the Artemis base camp, would subject our fragile, pressurized architecture to hours of unrelenting, high-amplitude mechanical torture. It is an environment perfectly designed to induce catastrophic metal fatigue, methodically shaking our life support systems to pieces and violently rupturing the microscopic seals that stand between our soft, water-based biology and the absolute, freezing nothingness of the dark. We are attempting to bolt our future to a rock that is actively thrashing in the void, a dying patient that will fiercely, mechanically shake off our arrogant attempts to conquer it. But the horror of the shrinking moon extends far beyond the immediate logistical nightmares of the Artemis program. It serves as a profound, terrifying philosophical warning about the true, unvarnished nature of the wider universe. For centuries, we have looked up at the glittering canopy of the night sky and harbored a deep, quiet hope that the cosmos was, at its core, a place of eventual sanctuary. We hoped that once we slipped the surly bonds of Earth, we would find a universe filled with quiet harbors and solid, welcoming shores. The agonizing tectonic death of the moon definitively shatters that hope. It proves with absolute, uncompromising clarity that the cosmos offers no safe harbors. The physical mechanics of the universe are characterized by a level of kinetic violence, extreme temperature, and sheer, crushing gravitational indifference that is entirely hostile to the very concept of biological life. If our closest, most familiar celestial neighbor, a rock that we have studied, worshipped, and practically considered an extension of our own planetary system, is actually a violently unstable, convulsing nightmare of crushing pressure and weaponized dust, what unspeakable, mechanical terrors await us in the deeper, darker gulfs of the solar system? If the moon, the ultimate symbol of celestial peace, is actively trying to shake us to death, what will we find when we finally set foot on the freezing, irradiated deserts of Mars, or attempt to navigate the crushing, turbulent atmospheres of the outer giants? The hostile shore of the moon is a chilling, undeniable testament to the fact that we are a fragile, localized anomaly. We are a miraculous, temporary spark of warm chemistry that evolved in an incredibly rare, perfectly balanced gravitational cradle, completely surrounded by an infinite expanse of absolute ruin. We can no longer look up at the night sky with the innocent, unburdened wonder of our ancestors. The silver disk hanging in the dark is not an invitation. It is a stark, brilliantly illuminated warning sign. It reminds us that our grand, biological ambition to spread across the stars is not a manifest destiny, but a desperate, terrifying gamble against the cold, unfeeling architecture of astrophysics. We are leaving the absolute safety of our dynamic, water-cushioned Earth to step onto a world that is quietly suffocating in the dark, squeezing itself to death, and violently tearing its own surface apart. We must accept the terrifying reality that the stars are fundamentally hostile, and that the universe does not care about our flags, our footprints, or our deeply ingrained illusions of cosmic permanence. Our very first, audacious step into the great, unexplored dark is not landing on a solid, reliable stepping stone. It is being placed, with blind, terrestrial arrogance, directly onto a highly pressurized foundation of shattering glass, waiting for the inevitable, violent snap that will instantly expose our profound fragility to the lethal, uncompromising physics of the void. Thank you for staring into the dark with me, and for daring to confront the terrifying, active realities of the worlds that surround us. This has been Still Science Lab. Good night, and I will see you in the next video.